Hello friends, today I have come to York University in Ontario to meet with Dr. Damilola Adebayo, a professor of history and award-winning researcher. Stay tuned for this one because it's going to be a great show and you don't want to miss it. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nnamdi Nake and I host Nationhood podcast. Our guest today is Damilola Adebayo, an assistant professor of history at York University in Ontario, Canada. Professor Adebayo is a historian of Anglophone West Africa, especially Nigeria. His interests lie at the intersection of social and economic history, science, technology, and society, and the role of international organizations in the African past. Damilola's current work investigates the varied contexts within which Western technology in energy, communication, and transportation were adopted, appropriated, hybridized, reinvented, or discarded, and the ways in which these technologies have been a cause and effect of change in African societies. In today's episode, we will be discussing energy technology in Nigeria from historical, current, and future perspectives. And so, without further ado, I am honored to welcome Damilola Adebayo to the Nationhood podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your podcast, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you for gracing Nationhood podcast. I'm excited to hear you talk about technology history, which is a field I'm also very interested and passionate about. And I believe our listeners would be enlightened on the relevance of energy and other technologies that Nigeria and Africa relies on. So, Dami, let's begin with your background as a historian and a researcher. You have quite a rich profile of achievements in the field of history. I only gave a short version of your bio, and I do want to mention the numerous awards you've received, right from undergraduate level to your master's, and even now as a full-time academic, winning awards, making so much impact. So clearly you are good at history, which is the question, and you have been recognized for being so good at it various times by different people, different bodies, different institutions. Can you tell me what you find so fascinating about history?
Honestly, I think my journey into historical research was actually, I would say it was based on serendipity. So I've always known that I am going to be a historian. Like, I have always known. It's that kind of knowledge that almost feels like an out-of-body experience, because till now I can't explain it. So even though in terms of religion I'm a Christian, but I can't even define it within the religious context. It just feels something. It's just a knowing, right? It's just a desire. It might help that I already have another historian in the family, someone that I genuinely look up to, someone who truly inspired me as a child and continues to inspire me even today. That's my uncle, who is also a professor of history in the US. And it might also help to know that I remember when he left Nigeria in the early 1990s or maybe the late 80s, I don't remember. When he left his library with us. So I had access to history books since I was a child, reading books that I didn't even understand.
Yes.
Books that I didn't, honestly. And because I've always been an indoor person, and I'm still, even till now, I'm still an indoor person. I don't really go out. So I've been reading a lot of history books. So the decision to study history is probably more like a natural course of events, because all those background experiences that I've had were not enough for someone to say, oh, let me devote my entire life. And that's where the serendipity aspect, the almost out of body experience came about. So I knew, so as of GSS3, the Nigerian middle school system, I knew I was going to go to art class just because of history. And my JAMB, my post-UME, was still called UME, I think they call it something else now, was first choice history, second choice history, And like they say, the rest is history. So I was in history, PhD was in history, and I still wake up every day feeling excited about what I do.
History.
Yeah.
Touche. That's an excellent point you make. History all the way. So this is not even something that started with undergraduate studies. Even in your JAM, first and second choice was history. And then in secondary school, that's middle school, the way we say in the Western world, you had this passion for history. So how does that compare with the notion people have that there's really not much you can do with history? Because I get the same question in Nigeria, in Canada, in the US, everywhere. People are like, when you tell people, yeah, historian, a lot of people tend to look at it like, what exactly do you do with that?
I won't lie to you.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I actually used the word serendipity and the out-of-body experience was because it was a conviction that I could not even explain at that time. And it's easier for me to justify why I'm doing history now.
Mm-hmm.
After all, I make a living
out of it.
And the Nigerian in me and the Nigerians who are observing me would see the professional aspects that, okay, after all, he's a professor. He's making a living. At least he has what can potentially can be called a middle class lifestyle, right? But 12 years ago, 16 years ago, I could not explain why I was doing history. And it gets worse. You know, when you're coming from a background where you've always been an high flyer and you have good grades, you have grades that were good enough to get into the so-called prestigious courses of study like law.
Yes.
Or actually law.
Yes.
Like my grades were good enough for that. So it was difficult for me. Even I remember then at the University of Ibadan that even I myself often felt inferior when I met law students, knowing that I had grades that were good enough at both the WAEC level, the UME level, and the post-UME to get into law. Knowing that my mark actually exceeded the cut-off mark and choosing history, it felt foolish to me, like many things that I can't explain to them. But now I'm grateful. Now I'm grateful that I made that decision. Now I'm grateful that I was more or less following an invisible hand that was really, really strong. That was really, really propelling me. And I'm glad that I'm able to sort of make a living out of it, because many people have probably followed this trajectory and they realize that they were foolish at the end of the day. So there is also the element of luck in the sense that I am grateful that this is working out well. I am grateful that I don't have to feel inferior when I am amongst colleagues doing other fields. And I'm grateful that I actually get to do research that I'm passionate about, and I can actually justify and I can actually see the significance of history both as an academic field of research, but also as a field that gives you skills that are transferable in other sectors of the economy. I mean, sometimes I joke that if I'm in the police force that I'll be a detective. Sometimes I actually joke that if I were to do medicine that I would actually like to be an infectious disease expert because of the research and writing. Sometimes I see myself, like I see those skill set and those desires manifesting across a wider range of careers right now. And even now I know that if I were to go into law, I already know the specialty that sort of aligns with my skill set, aligns with my interest, aligns with the kind of stuff that I want to do. I know already that I'll do intellectual property, and I would specifically focus on traditional knowledge. Like I know already how everything intersects. So at the end of the day, you're seeing interests that seem disparate, interests that seem so like, why am I interested in this and interested in these things at the same time? Like they don't align. But that was 20 years ago, that was 15 years ago. Now I see that, they actually align. It's the same person, it's the same skill sets coming together. The love for research, the love for writing, the love for investigation, the love for the road not taken. I mean, the love. I mean, I don't set out to be contrarian. That's not the goal. I'm not interested in necessarily being someone that is just contrarian. No. But at the same time, I'm just glad that my path often takes me through pathways that most people don't do, and
Yeah.
at the end of the day, things have worked out. So again, that's the part that I can't really explain. I mean, that's the luck, that's the grace, that's the serendipity, that's the faith, that's everything. Yeah.
You're blazing the trail, and I think I would hope it would inspire anybody in Nigeria, in Canada, wherever you are in the world. I mentioned all over the world because it's the same question I've been asked in Canada, I've been asked in Nigeria, in the US. What are you doing in history? Why are you interested? So I hope people will be inspired by your story and pursue their dreams. Okay, so this is a follow-up on the last question. I'm curious to know why you have settled on technology history, given that there are fields like economic history, political history, where historians, tend to make a big splash. That's what seems to interest the public a lot. Why technology history? What's so special about technology history?
Oh, everything. Everything. I'll start from the most obvious answer. We live in a world that is driven by technology these days. I mean, there is a whole lot of noise on the streets about the almost deterministic role of technology in our lives. Of course, technology determinism, I'm sure you're familiar with that concept, is a concept that historians have engaged for so long. Do we shape technology? Does technology shape us?
Yeah.
Those kind of questions. Do we influence the technology pathway? Do we influence our choices of techniques? Or are we constrained by environment? Are we this kind of questions, and also the question of momentum. But again, the point is, this is a topic that is timely. Obviously, this is a topic that is ongoing. Now we're moving into the world of artificial intelligence and augmented reality, and historians of technology would like to claim that these things that we see today have a longer history of how they've influenced change in society over time, and how people have also developed them, how people have invented, how people have worked with technology over time. So it's easy to start from the most obvious answer, but my conviction, my journey to the history of technology actually is much more complex than just following trendy topics. No, I didn't get into this field because of a desire to follow trendy topics. So after my undergrad, during my undergrad, the few people around me that inspired me were both political and economic historians. So the people, the big names in the field, as it were, in Nigerian history, that inspired me. I'm putting it that way because there were bigger names that were in the 60s and 70s interested in more questions of politics and biographies of great men, and as well as missions and history. But the people that inspired me, I'm talking about Nigerian historians like Ayodeji Olukoju, like Olutayo Adeshina, like even my uncle Akamu Adebayo. They were economic historians in many ways. And so I started off desiring to follow their pathway, desiring to do research in economic history. And I was also lucky that when I started applying for grad school, I was actually actively seeking out economic historians. Again, because of the desire. It was a desire, not necessarily much of a conviction, but a desire. But then even at that time, I knew already that the only way to test desire is to try something, right? I'm speaking within the context of research now. That the only way to test whether you really, really want to do something is to try it. Like once you get into it, you would know whether you're convinced or whether you're just playing around, And so I was lucky, privileged, or let's just say my paths were ordered enough to get into the supervision or to be mentored by one of the biggest names in African economic history, even till dates, really.
Who's this individual? Who's this
Gareth
individual?
Austin, Professor Gareth Austin. At that time, he was at the Graduate Institute, now called Geneva Graduate Institute in Switzerland.
Okay.
And I reached out to him, amongst other people that I reached out to for potential graduate supervision. And he responded so generously. And that kick-started a conversation that eventually led me to Geneva in 2014. And so I started working with him, learning from him, immersing myself in the literature, planning to do economic history. In fact, all kinds of economic history. I was interested in business history. I was interested in the labor side of things, labor and wages. You know, I mean, basically, I was interested in economic history broadly defined, and I had even started a proposed project on the Lagos Chamber of Commerce, which I had to abandon, by the way, and wrote a master's dissertation on the role of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, on labor policy making in colonial Nigeria from the 1930s to 1960, which eventually became a journal article published in 2021 or 2022 or thereabout. And then I started off again doing my PhD, also with the mindset of becoming an economic historian. Was working on Lagos Chamber of Commerce. Then for some reasons that I don't want to go into right now, I couldn't continue, and I had to start, and I had to do a new project. And so I thought, what about electricity? I was going to do mining history. You know, again, because I was interested in diverse aspects of economic history, and trust me, I'd been reading a lot at that time. So I'm not bragging. It was tough. It was intense. I had no life. Literally had no life. I was in Europe. I didn't travel around Europe. Yeah, that was how bad it was. And so moving to the UK for PhD, reading a lot. The original research on Lagos Chamber of Commerce failing, I was reading and looking for new areas of major that I could intervene. Started reading a book on mining. Bill Frant's book on, I think, labor in the Justin mine. And it was in that book that I discovered a reference to an hydroelectric infrastructure in Jos, the Kura Falls, that was built in 1929. There was a dam in Nigeria in the late 1920s. I was really taken aback because at that time, and even for many generation of Nigerians, when you think about hydroelectricity, you think of the Kainji Dam. So for me to read about a reference to an hydroelectric installation in 1920s Nigeria was sort of shocking to me. And this is someone that I would like to claim that I knew a lot about Nigerian history. I mean, general topics, obviously. And so I decided to talk to Gareth, like, Gareth, there seems to be something here. I was going to do mine, but now I'm like, this electricity subject, do we have any book or any major work on electricity in Nigeria? And then I started reading. I came across a few works, but I saw like major areas of intervention. And so Gareth thought, before you proceed, go to the archives first. Go check whether this gap exists, because it really exists. You know, because it's possible that the gap doesn't really exist because there is really nothing in the archives to fill it. And it's possible that there is a book somewhere that I've not read, you know, that I read that would have preempted most of my questions. So I went into the archives for 2 weeks and came back to the UK. So I went to Ibadan for 2 weeks, came back to the UK with what would eventually become about 40 to 50% of the archival records. In 2 weeks, I got thousands of documents that have never been used before, thousands of pages, and that eventually led to a race across multiple countries, doing research on electricity in the US at the World Bank archives, obviously because of the role of the IBRD and the World Bank in funding the Kainji Dam, doing research at the Library of Congress, doing research at the British Library in the UK, at the University of Cambridge Libraries, which was home-based. You know, it was on my own turf, so it was easy to just walk to the library. Doing research at other smaller archives, the Staffordshire County Archives, I believe, as well. A couple of archives and libraries all over the place. So in Nigeria, Kaduna, Enugu, Ibadan, Calabar, all over the place. So Nigeria, the UK, the US, those were the three main countries where I was just traveling around looking for resources. Again, don't forget, I'm now working on electricity, but I was still doing electricity as an economic historian. Right. So it was when I was then getting myself into the literature that I realized, wait a minute, everything I'm reading, they're mostly addressing electricity as technology. And also because there weren't much work on, not much has been written on electricity within the African context at that time, even till now, really. I mean, I recently completed a bibliographic essay trying to collect everything that has been published on electricity, and historically it's still not much. I mean, it's not the bibliography of the history of electricity, specifically history of electricity. Then I don't think you'd find 100 stuff, and I'm including stuffs published in local libraries that are not actually accessible online. Anyways, just to summarize the point, I suddenly found myself in the history of technology by accident. Once again, like many things I've been doing by accident. And so I started looking up online. By that time, to my shame, I had no idea that there was a field called history of technology. Honestly. And I'm talking 2016.
So, but is this not part of the problem? Actually, we're talking about that. There isn't enough awareness that there's a special
I had no idea that there was a field called history of technology. In fact, okay, I can share this in public because it maybe might help one or two person. It was curiosity. So one day I went online. By this time I'd been reading history of technology books. I've been getting research question inspirations from books published on history of electricity in the US, history of electricity across the world, in Europe, in Asia, in India, particularly in Latin America, and most especially in the United States. So I've been getting ideas from all of them. So I thought, I'm already doing history of technology. Is there anything called history of technology? So I went online doing research. And that was when I discovered the Society for the History of Technology myself. So I discovered the Society for the History of Technology just by accident. You know why I actually did that online research? It was the curiosity and the hustling spirit. Is there any funding for research in history of technology anywhere? And that was how I came across the Melvin Kranzberg
Award
fellowship
from
the Society for the History of Technology for dissertation fellowship, right? And so I paid the membership fee of SHOT, Society for the History of Technology, just because I wanted to apply for that fellowship. So it was more like it was a gamble, right? It was a $25 gamble, right? I paid $25 membership fee, which was way more than worth the money. And surprisingly, I won the fellowship the first year. So it was the first major validation that I received that I was onto something. Again, at that time, I was still identifying 70% as an economic historian and 30% as a historian of technology. But over time, I realized that the complicated relationship that I had with economic history was just becoming too glaring. The way it was being done, I don't want to go into that, but the way the quantitative revolution in economic history made sense, had a lot of usefulness, but the conclusions that some of those works were reaching, I wasn't convinced. And to make matters worse, the conclusions were being shrouded in methodological sophistry, in formulas and numbers that were impenetrable at first, but then once I mastered it and I learned to read economics papers, and I realized, wait a minute, it's the same conclusion that you make that historians have made since the 70s and 80s. And then you start reading something like, well, historians have made this conclusion, but they used anecdotal evidence. Now we are using empirical. And I'm like, okay. And then you check the data. And you realize it's based on guesstimates. Like if you check the hardcore data, like they have data points for 100 years with like 40 missing years, and then you guess. You guess you do backward projection and forward projection, and then you see how, for instance, you want to do research on, say, skilled labor in the whole of West Africa, and then you pick carpentry to represent all of skilled labor in Nigeria. You pick plumbing to represent all of skilled labor in Ghana, and then you do this kind of, and then at the end of the day, it's still the same.
And then you don't make general conclusions.
It's still the same critique of anecdotal evidence. So for me, it felt like, no, this is not what I want to do. I love stories. I'm comfortable telling stories. I want to see people's lives in my stories. I'm interested in economic life. I'm interested in people themselves. And so that was when I made up my mind. Like, okay, this is fully economic. I don't want to be identified primarily as an economic historian anymore, even though my interest in economic history remains. But the relationship was just too complicated, and I found a home in the history of technology. I realized the students were asking the kind of questions that interests me, and it was so easy to come up with new research questions to the point that right now, I have enough topics to last me for the rest of my career if I want to just stay within this field of economic history. Like, there is a lot to explore. There is a lot to unpack. I mean, your topic interests me. I've read only one conference paper. I've only had one conference paper around the issue of telegraph.
Yes, that was in 1984 or something.
I mean, there's so much to do. There is so much to do from African agency, from telling the stories of Africans who actually shaped technology in African history, to exploring the impact of even certain policies on technological development. So for instance, and now I'm coming to the present, for instance, today, there is the return to this state model of electricity generation in Nigeria today, where states now have the right to sort of they've had the right. They've been legally empowered technically since the NERC, the act that established NERC in 2005 or thereabout. But now it's they're basically more or less having their own state's electricity regulation agency, kind of state-based electricity. I'm just trying to simplify it.
This is how the guys in Abia State were able to run their own thing, right?
That's the example of Geometric in Abia State, Lagos State, and other. So states are now able to do that. But what we forget is that this same model already existed in 1910s. In the 1910s, Abeokuta generated its own electricity and became the second Nigerian town. Well, it wasn't yet Nigeria until 1914. By that time, southern Nigeria to have electricity to power the town in the early 1910s. They started construction sometime around 1910, 1911, and it was completed sometime around 1913, 1914. I'm not exactly sure because of the paucity of records and because of the paucity of record, particularly around the First World War period. But you see evidence of electricity already being in Abeokuta by 1916. You see evidence of it powering local industries, cottage industries, street lights, etc. The King's Palace and the homes of the so-called natives, as they were called, but the Africans, the Nigerians, who could afford it. And the same thing, and then you see other so-called native authority undertakings. In other words, what would be called local government today, were already investing in electricity, standalone electricity plants. And it continues in the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s until all those NA, Native Authority undertakings, were then taken over by the government and nationalized in 1950. So the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria that was established in 1950 then took over. ECN took over everything. So in other words, you have a situation where there was already regional level generation going on, or state level, or local government level generation going on in the 1910s of all the way to the 1940s. But now we think about it as something new. So you see a lot of lessons that can be learned from the past to even inform ongoing attempts to reform the power sector. So I have a paper that I haven't completed all this while, but it's entitled "Historical Dimensions on Electricity Power on Power Sector Reforms in Nigeria." Right. So I've been trying to just think through all the policies, all the ordinances, all the laws, all the responses to situations that arose in the colonial period and how the government fixed them, and to look at how those policies can fit into present day challenges. Because what you find today is that you find the Nigerian government often looking out to foreign experts or looking out to external ideas, thinking that instead of looking inwards. But again, I wouldn't blame them, because it's the publications on these documents on these subjects don't exist. So someone needs to do it. Again, these are things that excites me: the potential to connect the past with the present, and to even sort of join conversations about the future of energy technology in Nigeria. And obviously beyond energy technology, I'm also now interested in other forms of technology, looking at multiple questions that I can ask, multiple case studies, multiple thesis, dissertations that can be supervised. Like, there's just a lot to do. And I'm just grateful that, and then I'll go back to the very first point that I made, I'm grateful that I can do all of these things in a field that is now timely, in a field that is fashionable. I could work on topics that are timely, I could work on topics that are fashionable. Again, they're critical matters, but then they are also now timely. They're things that you can discuss now, because when you talk about technology and its impact on everyday life, you don't need to explain, you don't need to justify, you don't need to talk about the significance. Like, almost everyone understands how important technology is to our daily life.
I couldn't agree more about the point of having so much to do in the field of technology history, because maybe because much work hasn't been done in the field already, or there aren't so many people playing there, a lot of rich pickings. You will struggle to find what to discuss, topics, which is actually good. So a number of things come out of that. One is, what should African scholars be doing in this space? And again, I'm not so I'd like you to spend some time talking about that. But also, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about the place of Western technologies in Africa, Nigeria, the global South. Of course, we know that much of it was introduced during the colonial era, and people have raised questions like, was it merely a tool for imperialism, or was it a sign of modernity, or is there even necessarily a dichotomy between these two? And in your own case, do you hold one view over the other? And then if we zoom from what went on in the colonial era into the present, when we're talking about things like AI, that is obviously not being built in the global South or the global North, what should Africans be doing? What should historians, academics be doing, so that people understand what is going on with technology, not just from the past, but even from the present?
Okay, so I would attempt my answer is going to be reductive. It's probably going to be oversimplified.
Do you want to explain? Okay.
Yeah, it's probably going to be oversimplified because there's a lot to unpack in the two questions that you asked. So I'll start with the later question by attempting a simplified periodization of African history of technology, right? So if you want to talk about African history of technology or history of technology in Africa over the long durée, you start from the so-called pre-colonial period. Now, by pre-colonial period, we're just talking about the period before formal colonialism, not necessarily European presence or prehistory. We're talking about the period before formal colonialism. So we're talking about the period before the 19th century, because by the beginning of the 19th century, you already have formal colonialism starting in parts of Africa, right? I mean, Sierra Leone, Algeria, the Senegalese communes, Lagos in 1851 and then 61, and then all the way to the Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, right? November to February or thereabout. So again, that period, that's what we mean by pre-colonial period. So there's a lot to explore in that period, and because of the paucity of written records, right, in pre-colonial African history, we've often had to look to other disciplines, and archaeology is one field that is really, really critical to understanding the deep histories of technology in Africa, right? So I have big brothers, friends, mentors, role models, colleagues who are working on what I consider to be history of technology in pre-colonial Africa. They just see it as working with artifacts. But in their own research, for instance, we've been able to learn more about iron production in pre-colonial Africa and its sophisticated usage. We've been able to learn about glass production. We've been able to learn about ceramics, the knock culture. We've been able to learn about bronze and various metals. We've been able to learn about how some of these technologies were homegrown, and we've been able to understand the long histories of connections with the wider world, right? The Mediterranean world and even as far as China, when you consider the connection, for instance, between Zanzibar and the East African coast with the Indian Ocean world, right? That goes as early as like the 9th century, 10th century. So there is a lot, right? You can see that long history of technological trade in technology or artifact of technology, what we can call artifact of technology, then all the way to the 15th, 16th century, the transatlantic trade in Africans, where Africans were now being exchanged with European goods, the Dane gun, and other types of firearms and all other things like mirror, basic stuff, cloths, textile fabrics, chain, Western chain, and then you find all the way to the return when after the end of formal abolition of slavery, and then in the late 18th century to the 19th century, you find emancipated Africans in the New World returning to Africa amongst other places, coming back with their skill sets, coming back with knowledge, which prompted a form of Atlantic cosmopolitanism, particularly along the coast of West Africa, leading to the consumption of foreign ideas, foreign technologies mixed with local norms, local knowledge. So again, I'm trying to simplify this narrative by making a case that there's always been a relationship between Africa and the wider world since time immemorial, and that even technologies that were homegrown, like metal that were found in and made and used in Africa, glass, bronze, all kind of stuff, were also traded abroad, and we also received things from the wider world, right? And then all the way through the colonial period with the invention of modern technologies because most of what we consider to be modern technologies today are post-1870s post-1870s artifacts. For instance, electricity has always been known, for much of world history, really, if you go as far as even Greek mythologies and all of that, even in our own indigenous cosmologies, the idea of lightning and all of that, we've always had idea around electricity, really. But then electricity became a tool for modern life, for domestic electricity entered the domestic scenes in the 1870s. Thomas Edison's incandescent bulb, or if you take the British version of the story, Joseph Swan's invention of the bulb, and all through from the 1870s all the way, you find the introduction of new electrical appliances like the electric fan, like the kerosene refrigerator, which later became the electric refrigerator, like the air conditioning. These things are recent technologies, really. They're like post-1870s, post-1880s stuff.
Because you mentioned it, I saw. Sorry, I jumped in there. Just wanted to say that I saw someone advertising a kerosene refrigerator on Facebook Marketplace, and some of the comments people were excited about it, like kerosene fridge and all of that. And then I was surprised to find that in the 1930s, they were kerosene fridges.
These were commonplace.
So it's not new. Apparently, this is just a more efficient way of doing it, but it's the same thing.
And then you find, so the point I'm trying to make is that what we consider to be Western technologies are Western because their inventors are Westerners, and because they were probably first developed in Western societies, and I'm now in the colonial period from the 1880s, right? But their adoption had parallels in Western society. So even by the 1950s, you still had adverts in the US newspapers telling people how to use electrical appliances, and you also had adverts in Nigerian newspapers telling people how to use it. So these technologies were also new in Western societies amongst everyday consumers. So in other words, if you talk about the exchange, in African inventions in technology, the arts, the ceramics, the iron and other metals, and all the stuff that they did, and how they exchanged them for stuffs from other parts of the world, from the ancient times all the way to the evolution of modern technologies. It's always been a history of exchange. So it's not necessarily, of course, Africa is now we can even explore the topic of Africa as a dumping site for used products now. But the point is that if you talk about exchange, it's not so much that Africa has been like a recipient of technology alone. We're not just docile
So there's a
recipients.
cross-fertilization of
Exactly.
ideas.
We've always been critical recipients. You find Nigerians in 1920s, 1930s newspapers writing opinion pieces, writing letters to the editors, commenting on these things, giving their own ideas, expressing themselves on how we should adopt these technologies, on their prices, on how to make things cheaper and accessible to the common man, etc. So you find that all the way to the present, it's always been a case of, of course, there was a global divergence. I mean, there's always been divergence in terms of African inventions not being used in the modern world and not being fit for purpose in the modern world in terms of, I mean the old precolonial inventions. Was, do not forget that the evolution of modern technology, particularly electrical appliances, coincided with that period that is associated with the beginning of colonial rule, the 1880s. So, at the same time that new electrical appliances were being invented in Europe and North America, was the same time that African territories were actually being effectively occupied by Europeans, and the destiny of Africa's economic development, socioeconomic development eventually came under the influence of Europe and North America. And so we sort of became not just a consumer of technologies, but also a consumer of political ideas, also a consumer of economic policies from the metropoles. So it's not just a question of Africa just being docile recipient. I hope I have not complicated the answer. Then what should we be doing? The second part of the question is there's so much to do. So for instance, in Chile, at the recently concluded conference of the Society for the History of Technology, I ran a panel with one of my big brothers in the field, Dr. Abidemi Babalola, who is currently at the British Museum.
I attended that session, I remember.
On archaeology and the pre-colonial histories of technology in Africa. I think there is a lot to explore when historians begin to have conversations with archaeologists who work within the realms of artifacts and who are exploring the social life of these things. You know, to paraphrase the anthropologist, I think Ajana Padura, social life of things, right? So there's a lot to uncover when we more or less explore the social life of things, the context within which they are found, the strata within which they are found, their usefulness and exploration. Then I'm also beginning to have conversations with people in intellectual property law now. So for instance, I have a good friend who, again, we're at the early stage of these conversations, who is a lawyer and completing his PhD in intellectual property. And we've just started talking about how conversations around indigenous knowledge has been operating in silos. Historians and humanistic scholars are having their conversations around indigenous knowledge, dating back to the 90s, even sometimes to the 80s. Whereas lawyers are talking about traditional knowledge and genetic resources, and they also are having their own conversations that dates back to the 80s and 90s and 2000s. So we're now also looking at how we can speak to one another and have conversations, interdisciplinary conversations that are useful. So apart from historical research, there is also a large room for multidisciplinary engagements, even with economics as a field. As much as I sort of detest some of the methods that is applied to African economic history in particular, there is still a lot of room for engagement. within the realms of, and now that data, the quality of African data is really improving, there is a lot of room for engagement with to measure impacts on a micro scale, even on a macro scale, to generate data sets that are comparable across multiple regions of the world, so that we're not just coming to conclusions within our local African spaces alone, but we are also generating results that can be compared, like numbers for numbers, with other regions of the world, fact for fact, of course, numbers that can be trusted, numbers that are good, not just, and then analysis that makes sense, not just forcing data to say what we want it to say. Again, there's always running jokes and statistics around how statistics can be made to say whatever you want to make it say. Anyways, but the main point is there's a lot of room for collaboration. There's a lot of room for interdisciplinary conversations within the realms of history of technology in Africa. There's a lot of room for conversation with historical anthropologists as well, and even room for conversations with people in the natural sciences and engineering. Like, there is a lot of room for collaboration. You find the historian should be having conversations, for instance, with a pharmacist. The historian of medicine who is interested in medicinal plants should be having conversations with pharmacists in terms to understand certain concepts, certain breakdowns, to understand how things have happened. So, for instance, you have books on bioprospecting, pharmaceutical prospecting in African history, but the research on this topic is not really, it's still growing, like it's not fast, yes. So there is a lot of room for collaboration, there's a lot of room for conversations with other scholars in other fields. Yeah.
And I feel like, just to ride on that point you make, even with experts in the field, one of the technologies I am not worried about but concerned is AI. I've held the view for quite some time that AI, even though it's autonomous in the sense that artificial intelligence supposedly has its own sentience, so to speak, but I've always felt like AI still has limitations in terms of the extent to which it can think for itself and act for itself. That's been my own belief from some literature I've read. But I've recently read some more literature that suggests to me that AI might actually be able to go off on its own without human direction.
There is a lot in the realm of scientific fiction. I mean, there are movies dating back to the 80s and 90s on this subject.
Yes.
And I think I'm not an expert on AI. I need to make that clear. I am absolutely no expert on this topic, but based on what I've read in the history books, I think it would be overly simplified to say there is no cause for alarm. I mean, there is probably indeed a cause for alarm, and especially when you follow regulatory the language of regulation and also some laws that have been passed, and also when you read, say for instance, I was just reading casually, as I always do. I was reading about the history of Boston Dynamics, this robot company. Boston Dynamics, they make dogs.
The one who make the dog, it's all over social media, dancing and running.
Exactly, and I was reading, just funny enough, I was just reading about them yesterday, just randomly reading for whatever reason, and I realized, because the reason I was reading about them was because I'm like, why are they called Boston? That's the way my brain was like, why Boston? Why is there Boston in the name? Like, and tech companies are like typically California based, right? So why are they in Boston? Like, then I realized, it was a spin-off from a research lab at MIT, and it's actually not a young company, because I used to think it was a company that was established in maybe the mid 2000s. I didn't realize that it was actually a 90s company, like early 90s kind of company. And so I started reading around them and what they've done. But one of the things I read was that they actually signed a commitment that they were not going to allow their robots to be weaponized. So in other words, there is a possibility for weaponization of AI. There is a real threat for the weaponization of technology.
Yeah.
So, and the more advanced technology become, the more palpable the fear that if these things were to use a human attribute right now, like go mad on you, like if they were to run mad, as it were, like if you were to lose control, it would be catastrophic for humanity, right? So, and you've seen all shades of such catastrophes in movies.
Yes.
How, robots took over the world, or how cyborgs took over the world. Cyborgs are like the fusion of technology and humans, right? And so you find
AI and robots together.
Exactly. Or you find one computer hijacking things and basically determining that human beings are the virus.
Absolutely. So this is exactly the point. This is exactly the point I was trying to make. I'm glad you brought it there, because I recently completed Yuval Noah Harari's latest book, Nexus. Excellent book. And I thought he raised some interesting questions, like the one you just raised now. What if this AI decides that human beings are the problem? Particularly if human beings are trying to shut them down. And then they're like, no, shutting them down is like trying to kill them. And they say, rather than you kill us, we're going to kill you.
I am more optimistic about the future.
I know, but
based on history.
I agree with you. Yeah. The point I'm trying to make here is bearing these kind of things in mind, without prejudice to whether they are true or not. Where should countries like Nigeria or countries in the global south be headed? Because these technologies, and if you think about things like social media websites, internet generally, they use our data. They know everything about us in Africa. We don't have much control over what's going on in those spaces. Is there a risk? Should we be concerned?
Of course there is.
Are there human rights challenges, and then what should Africans be doing?
Of course there are human rights challenges. Yeah. It's a question of agency. I think we've been recipients for way too long. And I think if we're going to be just consumers, we should at least have a say in how we consume stuff. And obviously, I'm not the only one thinking along this line. I follow a couple of people online. I know a lawyer, an international lawyer, incidentally also at York University. I think is an assistant professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. I've never met him, but I admire his work. His first name is Jake. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but I think it's Efodu. And I read what he does. I see within the realms of AI regulations, domesticating policies, building systems, and he's not alone. I've seen him with colleagues in the field, having conversations around artificial intelligence and human rights, tech and human rights, tech laws. It's a question of agency, really, like I said. The ability of individual countries, Nigeria and other global south countries, to sort of stamp their feet and say, this is how far you go and no further. These are the policies that might be applicable in the US context, but would not be applicable in the Nigerian context. Haven't you wondered how when you travel, say, to the UK, certain apps don't work the same way they work in Canada? And I've noticed that a lot in the US.
Or even Dubai, WhatsApp wouldn't work in Dubai, for example.
I realized in the US, for instance, that even the same app that I have on my phone, the functionality, the way YouTube is the simplest example, right? You can, if you're not on YouTube, if you don't have YouTube Premium, for instance, you cannot minimize YouTube here. But in the US, you can do that. The same app. Like you can just minimize. You can minimize YouTube app on your phone and it continues to play
and do all that
without premium in the US. I've experienced that on my phone. And then you move to Canada, it doesn't work. So you see the differences even in how technology is domesticated in different individual countries. Also, some of the technologies that we think are advanced by now are not necessarily super advanced. The advancement has been in place since the mid-2000s. I listened to a podcast called Business Wars. And one of the stories that season that I finished the season like 2 weeks ago was the war between Nintendo and not Nintendo, PlayStation and Sony versus Microsoft. That's Xbox and PlayStation, but Nintendo also featured in the story. And I realized that actually Xbox developed a controller in I think it's in the mid-2000s. I can't remember if I'm getting my periods right. That that makes you the controller, not the, you don't need a joystick, you don't need to hold something. And the system was so advanced that it had infrared for tracking, it had cameras, it had almost everything that you would think would make up for an advanced technology by 2024 standard was already possible. But it was shut down because it was considered invasive, extremely invasive. Like you have something watching you 24/7 in the house. It was shut down. So, the point is, it's a function of individual countries' response to how far things can go. I'm still listening to another episode of the same, another season right now. I'm completing another season of that, the same podcast, Business Wars. This one is Napier versus the music industry. So I'm learning for the first time that I was actually in the early 2000s, they emerged this music sharing platform, Napier. Called Napier, that allowed people to distribute music for free. They were shut down by the music industry, but now the same music industry lead the streaming business, incorporated them into the. So what I'm trying to say is, some of the things that we're scared of, I think human beings are. I believe in humanity, and I think human beings are rational. Again, there are always crazy people who imagine every now and then, but I think human beings are rational. I think that even businesses thrive, businesses make decisions to survive, right? So, because in the first boom, the first bust, the first .com bust of the, well, I'm calling it the first, but at least the 2000s, the bust, was many companies of that era thought they were overruling the norm, thought they were upsetting, thought they were basically
completely changing the
status quo. But you find out that in 2024, it's still the same old brick and mortar investors of the 1950s, 1960s that are now metamorphosing into the money power bank behind the tech companies. So it's still the same set of people. We think that, Facebook is what it is, but the shareholders of Facebook, the nameless, faceless shareholders, are still the same guys, the same investment companies that have been existing for decades. It's the same. So at the end of the day, I think that human beings one thing that makes us human is our infinite capacity for adaptation, for adapting to situations. And I think that things would get better, technology would improve our lives. There is a risk for catastrophe, but at the same time, I think that the world will respond. I just hope that it doesn't take a crisis, because sometimes, it takes crisis for us to adapt to certain things. For instance, it took the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, for us to adapt to virtual life. Even though Zoom as a business has been existing since 2011. It took COVID-19 for us to adapt to that. For us to realize that we can actually live online, we can actually have virtual stuff like that. Major conferences that you would never assume can be done remotely are now being organized remotely, and they're charging you a arm and a leg to even attend remotely.
Exactly.
Things that nobody would ever consider paying for 5-10 years ago, or even in 2020 January, things that you would never consider paying for. But now they charge you thousands of dollars to attend an online training. And you pay gladly because that's the best you can get, and there's a lot of user experiences that have been built around these technologies that is improving our lives. Yet, don't we exactly? well, let's not.
Okay, we're getting deeper.
Let's not go into that. Let's not go into that. But again, at the end of the day, there are also worries about even the technologies that we're using now. There are worries about mobile phones tracking everything we see. There are worries about social media tracking everything.
But they certainly are, because you talk to somebody about something, and next thing you're seeing advertisements on that thing popping up on your social media.
There is a guy that I follow on Twitter. I can't remember his name now, unfortunately, because I like to acknowledge stuff. He runs this series of the long history of X happening to Y. And it's funny. For instance, there was a series, quick digression from
of course,
a series on how kids today are more badly behaved than kids were in the past. And then it would bring
newspaper evidence. So he uses newspapers to do it. He'll bring newspapers to show 2024 kids today are worse than they were in the past. 2010. Complaining kids today are worse than the past. 1980, complaining that kids today are worse than the past. 1950, 1910, 1880. Like, you're like, okay, so when was there ever a time that kids have been good? Because sometimes we have this nostalgia about the glorious past, things that don't necessarily exist, and it's the same fear that we have about technology. The same way people resist new technology. Now today we can't think of without. Most people don't even think about mobile phones anymore, but I remember people arguing in early 2000s Nigeria that mobile phones would cause cancer. I remember people making a case that it's unsafe to walk outside because of all the mobile waves and all of those stuff. There might be some legitimacy to that argument.
Even among phone users, let me give you an example. Yeah. I recall when folks refused to buy touchscreen phones. They wanted the keypad on because they felt the ones with touchscreen, the screen will break. Now you can't even see a keypad phone anywhere.
It's
you can hardly.
Phones with keypads are even exotic.
Exactly, they're exotic items now. Everybody's using the touchpad. But then when BlackBerry Bold and 2 came out, people were like, no, touchscreen.
So you find that people often resist new technologies. And there is a book about, also the idea that technology would improve our lives. It's been proven from time immemorial that sometimes technology just creates new work. It doesn't necessarily make our life easier. So for instance, there's a book by this professor, I think she was based at the University of Pennsylvania, Ruth Cohen, More Work for Mothers. Like literally people thinking technology are like energy saving, time saving, but ultimately creating more work. There is another, I'm trying to remember another.
I've referenced her book. She was talking about domestic technologies.
Exactly.
About how women use microwaves and washing machines. How it
actually lets more work for women in the house instead of saving time. How it actually lets you. Then there are other books, there are other research, and unfortunately I can't remember now, that also talks about how new technologies actually create new work. I mean, I don't even need a book to talk about this. I mean, there is no such thing as the field of the entire profession of content creation as we know it today in the mid 2000s. I mean, be an Instagram influencer as your career. In 2024, it's a career. They're probably making 10 times the salary of a professor. But Instagram did not exist 15 years ago.
And it's driving whole new behaviors.
Exactly.
So people know that they can do this. So they
we have new vocabularies. Selfie.
It's
hard to think that the word selfie.
And it led to the creation of new technologies in phones. So phone makers realized people want to take selfies. And so they design phones that can take selfies.
It's hard to think that the word selfie did not exist in the early 2000s, that there was no camera phone in 2000, at least for domestic application. Maybe it existed for military use, but it's hard to think that there was no camera phone in the early 2000s. It's hard to think that there was a time that Suraya was the satellite phone that we are hailing. Now people are hailing the potential of Elon Musk's Starlink to create a satellite phone on a wide basis, like on a commercially viable basis that is just completely developed dependent on satellites. So you find that people would always adapt. That's the way human beings are, and we won't become lazier, we won't become weaker necessarily. New occupations will emerge, new at the end of the day, each country would have to determine their own, just to quickly wrap that up, each country would have to determine their own futures, their own technological futures. There's a chance to do it now. There's the need for a political will. Again, like I said, I hope that it doesn't take a crisis to get that.
Building on that last comment you made, I'm curious to know what kind of connections can be drawn between technology in general and nation building. You think about post-colonial leaders or independence, movement leaders in Africa like Nkrumah, who was really anxious to use the Volta Dam Project to prove Africa's ability to deliver on massive technology projects. And then people like Nyerere in Tanzania, who had this whole plan for agriculture to industrialize that sector and what have you. So what kind of connections can we make here?
There is a simple way to answer the question without complicating it. There's so many ways to answer it, but the simplest way is just to adopt the concept of leapfrogging.
Okay.
Yeah. So the idea is that Africa today is only, for the most part, 64 years old post-independence. Most countries in Africa, about 19 or 21 of them, gained independence between 1960 and 1961. Like in that 1 year period, many countries attained independence. So 1960 is often seen as the year of independence, even though Ghana would like to claim that they attained independence a few years earlier. Now, the idea is that Europe has had centuries to develop itself, and has had to go through multiple forms of industrialization, right? Like over time, like the first industrial revolution, but even before that, simpler machines, simpler tools, and then the industrial revolution that led to the wide adoption of steam machines in factories, and then eventually electricity replacing steam as the dominant energy for life and industry, eventually large-scale railways, electric railways, eventually postal system, road networks, now emails, now today instant messages, now today high-speed travel, aircraft and everything. So the idea is that if a new country is just starting a journey, so for instance, pick a village in rural northern Nigeria. If you want to connect that village to the world, as it were, you don't necessarily have to start the journey by first building a medieval road or building a road for horse-driven carriage, or even introducing a post office. You can just go straight with a mobile phone. You can just leapfrog. You can skip all the multiple stages of growth that other Western countries are about to go through and just jump to the present. So that's the idea of leapfrogging. And that idea was also really, really ripe. It was also popular in the 1960s at independence. So for instance, many leaders believed that political independence was not complete without economic freedom, without economic independence, right? And so it wasn't only important to attain independence from European powers. Africans must also be able to sort of channel their own economic destinies. And one way to do that was to provide energy for industrialization. So hydropower, especially, the example of, since you mentioned Nkrumah's Volta River Project, hydropower deserves a space in any syllabus on the issue of technology. You can't just teach Africa, even globally, you can't just teach hydropower as part of large-scale infrastructure. It deserves its own full-scale standalone, because hydropower was so important to economic development across late colonial and early post-colonial Africa, to the point that countries thought it was the magic wand.
Nigeria has to do the Kainji one.
Just build a power station, large scale one, to supply, for the most part, under 1,000 megawatts for the most part, at least for the first phases. But to supply several megawatts of electricity, and your life will become instantly better. Of course, we have the report card. We know the story. Right, but from Kaura Bassa Dam that was built by the Portuguese, to the Kariba Dam, the Central African Confederation, that's Malawi and the other two countries, all the way to the Owen Dam, Nalu Bale Dam in Uganda, all the way to Volta Dam in Ghana, all the way to dams in Nigeria, beginning with Kainji Dam, or even Aswan Dam in Egypt, all the way to, you can go all across the entire continent. Victoria Falls Power Station in the Southern African region. You can go across. They were really, really critical to the potential economic development of those regions where they were installed. Again, we have the report card. But beyond the present day abysmal record of power generation in Africa, even including South Africa, beyond the present day, beyond the present day abysmal record, the ambition of the 1960s cannot be overemphasized. The ambitions were countries were ambitious. They were hoping that large scale infrastructure and technology would bring economic change, and the desire. It's not surprising. I guess the world people are eternally optimistic. The hope that technology will bring about change still persists. So, for instance, using Nigeria as an example again, just was it a few days ago, the Lagos state government just opened another line on the train, on the light rail service.
Yeah, the red line goes all the way to Iju.
Exactly, and there's now that hope again that transportation time will be reduced significantly. The whole idea of integrating the entire country through mobile money platforms, the whole idea of connecting people across the world through educational platforms, through you still find people excited, particularly young people working in the gig economy, excited about the potential of technology. And
so there are global connections going on as well,
so,
local development.
So technology is quite important, and countries would continually, countries are talking about it all the time. In fact, they use it as the same way they use electricity till date in every election, right? We'll give you power, we'll give you power. It's the same way technology is now becoming a staple of African electoral manifestos, right? So you find that technology is featuring prominently in the campaign documents and the policy documents. Young people are asking questions about the technological trajectory that the country would follow under the leadership of a particular politician or the next. So you find that in general there is almost a determined Africans, and I think Global South citizens tend to view technology as deterministic. We tend to forget that, particularly in the case of our own region, there's a lot of human hand that is still required to shape politics, shape technology. There is a wide room in the policy generation area. There is a wide room, even a wider room in the policy implementation area as well. So even when the rules are in the books, as either as simple rules, executive orders, acts of parliament, are they enforced? There's a lot of room there's a lot of opportunities for us to shape our own destinies. So, for instance, in the world of money transfers, Nigeria, I'm sure you're familiar, recently introduced a policy that prevented foreign-based companies from sending money to Nigeria. Like financial technologies also that can also aid and abet crime. Insisting that if you want to transfer, if you want to operate, you have to have a local office that would comply with the local financial policies. You find those that's an example, for instance, of us taking our destiny into our own hands.
And for people like us, this kind of law is relevant because if you're going to send money to people at home using platforms like Lemonade or Lemfi, all those apps, then they need to have this kind of licenses you're talking about.
The local licenses, so
they
that
need to have that, otherwise they can't give you the service that you need.
Also to protect consumers. Who do you report to? Thankfully, living in Canada and doing this in Canada, if I transfer money through a Canada-based company or a company that has an office in Canada, at least I have some institutions to resort to for help if anything goes wrong. But then, if you don't have an office in Nigeria and you're living in Nigeria, who do you talk to? So those are the kind of questions, or recently, for instance, I was just reading in the news that the Minister of Aviation, Festus Keyamo, rather, I was going to mention.
Former long time ago. Emeritus.
Exactly. So Festus Keyamo recently introduced the rule. Of course, we don't know whether it will be enforced or not. That is asking airlines to use Nigerian vendors cook food for the outbound flights, flights originating, flights leaving Nigeria.
Yes.
He's not saying they should cook Nigerian food, but that Nigerians can actually also prepare meals to the standard of airlines.
100%.
Exactly. So those kind of rules, there's still a lot of room to play around in the policy space and the policy arena. And we're not just talking about tech alone now. We're talking. In fact, the one that shocks me the most is Professor Ondubuisi. I think his name is Ondubuisi. Ekekwe. I read his post and I enjoy his
very
work.
brilliant.
Exactly. I mean, I actually enjoy. I enjoy reading scientists who know how to write, like scientists who really know how to write.
Yeah.
It's also why I actually first came across your work and I felt like I realized you're original engineer, like you write this way.
Thank you.
Professor Ekekwe wrote something a while back that shocked me. That I didn't even realize that was a major gap. The Nigerian NIN does not expire. The Nigerian National Identity Number does not expire.
Yeah.
That's a wide room for criminality out there. So it means that after the death, and people die every day.
Yeah. So
it means that the NIN can be used, NIN of dead people can be collected, and considering that the country doesn't really have a database for people who are dying, it means that people can do crime with real life details of dead people.
Yeah.
And so that's a space within which for policy, right? And it's not just like policy from the Act of Parliament. No, this is requires multi-sectoral in collaboration. The banks must collaborate with the telephone companies. The telephone companies must collaborate with all the vendors that require NIN. Every service that require NIN, every sector, there's a need for collaboration. Like it's important. Like, that was something that shocked me, for instance, and that's something with significant negative implication for financial technology, for instance, financial crimes too. I mean, and even as we go into the world of biometrics and the likes, when your two-factor authentication is dependent on external controls, like say for government stuff, NIN or date of birth and passwords, and when you can hack the NIN database, then what does that tell for the future of the technology in the country? So again, these are the kind of questions that we should be talking about. So in Nigeria, it's not just a question of the capacity of AI to change things,
but even also the policy frameworks and implementation. I agree with you, because I was in Nigeria recently, as you know, doing some archival research, and one of the biggest issues I had was the communication. But the point I want to make here relates to how even these big companies, MTN, Airtel, are not collecting proper biometrics from people. I'll give my two experiences with two of them. With MTN, I had to buy 3 different lines. And the lines, each one had problems. But the point is, each time I went there and I had to go my NIN slip, they had to take my biometrics again. And it was the same store. So it wasn't even a different. Okay, the first time was one store, but the next 2 times was the same other store.
I've submitted my biometrics many times, so I agree with I know what you're saying.
But you have my NIN, so why are you taking my picture again and taking my thumbprint again? So that means...
And they're not just taking for verification, they are taking for registration.
Exactly, they are registering you free. Exactly, that's what I mean. They should have just taken it to verify this is who you are. But they can't verify, it's not there. And one happened within a space of 30 minutes. The lady was doing, she made a mistake. She started, I was like, why stop? You just took my picture. You just took my. Why are you taking it again? That's MTN. With Airtel, when I got tired of MTN, I said I'm changing loyalties this time. I was at the store, and it was one finger they used to capture my 5 biometrics. Instead of capturing the 5 different ones, the guy just took my finger. He put it the first time, the second time. So he just let's get this job and go. You know, Airtel, the company, will think their staff are collecting biometrics. Nigerian Communications Commission would think Airtel is collecting biometrics, but none of this is happening. And so when people want to commit crime, steal an NIN like you say and all that, it should be very easy for people to hide. I know we're out of time, so if you can just answer this last question in 1 minute and then we can wrap up. This has to do with your book that you're working on. I just want to tell us the title of this book, what the book is about, and maybe some of the key arguments you are making.
Thanks for the question. So I'm currently basically revising a manuscript, tentatively entitled Power and the People, Electricity and Urban Life in Nigeria, 20th-Century Nigeria. And in the book, I am exploring the long history of electricity, actually over a 100-year period, so not just the 20th century, going back to the 1860s all the way to the early 1970s, exploring how electricity has been used, so consumption, of production, distribution, and consumption of electricity. It's a social history, socioeconomic history research project. So I'm not really focusing on financing a lot per se, but I'm actually mostly interested in how people have used electricity, how Nigerians have consumed electricity, and I'm actually, the book is driven by three main arguments, right? So first, I am making a case that right from its inception, even before the inception of the first power plants in the 1890s, but right from the inception throughout the entire period, electricity was not just a tool of exploitation as you would find in other case studies. So for instance, when you read the history of electricity in the Southern African context, because Southern Africa had a huge, big mining complex in their area, electricity came about to just facilitate the exploitation of mining resources, mineral resources. But in the case of Southern Nigeria, in the case of Nigeria, electrification began as a technology of progress. Nigerians just desired progress. Lagos was not a mining town. Lagos, where it all began in Nigeria, was not a mining town. Wasn't even an industrial hub when it all began.
More like a trading post.
It was more like the only thing that could really make us call it a commercial city was maritime trade. So it was a non-mining town, and it wasn't even a settler colony. So it wasn't like, oh, there's so many white people here, so let's introduce electricity to improve their lives.
Yeah.
So you find electricity was introduced in Nigeria as a part of modernity. There's a book, a new book that actually even goes into the economic history of Lagos in much more details, that actually shows the plight of African entrepreneurs under capitalism, under colonialism, capitalism in the colonies. That's the title. It's recently published by A.G. Hopkins, Professor Anthony Gerald Hopkins. Exactly. And so you're able to learn some of the argument that I have made first in my dissertation and now in my book. Now I have to cite the book to further reinforce those arguments, because sometimes my claims seem outlandish. Like,
what are you saying?
Are you sure? But now we have a big book that actually reinforces what I'm saying.
From London Hopkins
exactly,
himself.
from Hopkins himself. So I'm just grateful that that at least helps me to set explain the economic context within which Africans' ability, the desire of Nigerians to consume electricity right from its inception originated. So that's the first argument. I'm making the case that electricity serves the purpose of both exploitation, of course. The Enugu coal mine, for instance, was there. The Justin mines, the cases were there as well. But domestic application right from its inception all the way to the 1970s. That's the first point. The second point that I'm making is that the history of electricity in Nigeria actually had parallels with the same stories, the same narratives that you find in Western societies in the same period. So for instance, in other words, you can talk the same way you talk about the allure of urban life driven by electricity, bright lights, the Times Square in New York, how they talked about fascination with lights, Broadway in New York, talk about fascination with lights at the beginning of the 20th century. It's the same way Nigerians were, albeit on a smaller scale, talking about the allure of urban life driven by electricity itself. The same narratives about consumption of electrical appliances. So you find parallels, even though it operated on a smaller scale.
Yeah.
Nigerians were actually consuming power too, and there was a craze for power too. In fact, there is a direct quote from an archival image describing Ibadan, not Lagos, Ibadan as a city crazy on electricity. And I'm quoting verbatim now.
from the late 40s, right? But as a city crazy on electricity, and there was an image of a popular building. The building actually features every now and then on social media, right in the center of town, just across Maple Hall, that was actually brightly lit with light at night, signifying, of course, access to domestic light in your house, wealthy man. And then across the street were like mud houses that didn't have lights, but there was street lights passing across. So in other words, even when you were not rich enough to buy electricity, to pay for electricity in your home, you benefited from the street lights passing in front of your house. So again, I'm making those kind of cases. And then the third argument I'm making is that the desire of electricity in Nigeria and the parallels you see was actually underpinned by financial capability. So I've mentioned native authorities, for instance. So I'm doing like case studies of actual local investments by Nigerians themselves in the colonial period. Electricity is seen as a tool of empire, but here you see Nigerians themselves coming together, raising taxes, drawing from their surplus revenues, from their wealthy NA reserves, and investing in power. So you find this kind of narratives. I'm telling stories. I'm not just interested in, tin mining, electricity, diamond mining in Southern Africa. I'm not just interested in the imperial side of the story.
The extraction and the exploitation, but the complications as well.
I'm interested in everything. Of course, I'm not saying that those other narratives are less important. In fact, I have a second project that would address some of the external aspect, the international side of this story, particularly with reference to the Kainji Dam. But I'm saying for this first book, I'm more interested. I've tried to simplify my arguments in like into those 3 points, distill them into those 3 points, and I hope that when it eventually comes out, that it would the book itself would do justice to some of the points that I've just made.
I'm looking forward to it. I am absolutely looking forward to it. Professor Adebayo, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
I will be very happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
So friends, that was Damilola Adebayo, an assistant professor of history at York University. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, thank you for watching.